Welcome, everyone, to the Washington Institute's Policy Forum on the U.S. Iraq Strategic Dialogue that started yesterday. And I'm delighted to be moderating this discussion. I am Dr. Dave Pollack, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute. And we have an expert panel that will tell us something about both the background and the future prospects for this very important bilateral U.S.-Iraq dialogue that was kicked off just yesterday. For those of you who would like to listen in Arabic, أنا أرحب بكم جميعا. Please press the button at the bottom of your screen. اضغط الإشارة في أسفل الشاشة للغة الترجمة باللغة البرتغالية. I'm sorry, it has to say مكتوب برتغالية لكن الترجمة بالعربي. Okay, so again, welcome to all of you, whether in Arabic or in English. And without further ado, I am just going to briefly mention our participants. Today, we have, first of all, leading Iraqi expert, political analyst, and fellow pollster, Munqith Dagher. We have my colleagues from the Washington Institute, two of them, Ambassador Barbara Leaf, former U.S. ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, and someone with long experience and expertise in Iraq and in the Gulf and in U.S. policy generally, and Bilal Wahab, another senior fellow, the Lapidus Senior Fellow. Is that right? No, Bilal. The name of your fellowship, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, who is himself of Iraqi origin, now joining us in Washington, D.C. And each one will talk for about 10 minutes, and then the second half of our hour together will be devoted to your questions and comments and the panelists' answers. I may take the opportunity to offer a few comments myself at some point. For your questions and comments, please write them in the chat room. The chat function at the bottom of your screen will take your questions either in Arabic or in English, as you like. And I want to also thank our very good friend and colleague, Mohammed Abdulaziz, my Arabic language editor for the Fikra Forum blog, Muntada Fikra, who will be doing the translation for us from English into Arabic today. So thanks again to our distinguished panel, to all of you in the audience, and without further ado, the floor is yours, Munqith, please.
Thank you, David. Thank you for everyone. Thank you for Washington Institute to host this session about the U.S. Iraq strategic dialogue. This dialogue, which has been kicked off yesterday, is the most recent milestone in a long way of U.S. Iraq relationship, which was ups and downs for almost two decades right now. So this is a new milestone. Hopefully we will going ups again. This dialogue came after serious debates took place, whether in Washington, D.C., or whether in Baghdad. And as Iraqi, I'm so aware about those debates in Iraq, which put a lot of pressure on the newborn government of al-Kadhimi, especially regarding the U.S. military existence in Iraq, and the pressures which have been made on al-Kadhimi government and, of course, the delegates to direct them in one way in this regard. So there was a serious pressures on the delegates, on al-Kadhimi, and as a parliament system, you know that the strength of any government depends mainly on the support of the parliament member, on how many seats it has to support its especially strategic decisions like this dialogue. So unfortunately, al-Kadhimi, he has no seats in the parliament. He did not came through electoral process. We know that there was a kind of compromise between different parties, and al-Kadhimi eventually came. So from my point of view, the most important factor gave al-Kadhimi his strength in conducting this dialogue with U.S. Was the popular support. And this has been to test whether he really had this popular support, which can be used by al-Kadhimi government as a leverage in his negotiation or in his dialogue with United States. So as a pollster, I wanted to know the opinion of Iraqis in al-Kadhimi, and whether he has a real stable popular base which he can back up him in his dialogue. So what I will show now is the most recent numbers which I have from my team poll, which has been conducted during last week. Yesterday we have finished the field work, and I'm delighted here to share it with you. You will be the first one who will see these numbers, these figures. So anyway, I will go ahead without these numbers. I will look at the numbers on my phone to not forget anything. So after almost 3 weeks, less than 1 month of the government of al-Kadhimi, we have really inspiring number. And according to a question about the favorability of the Prime Minister al-Kadhimi, we ask whether the Iraqis have favorable or unfavorable opinion in al-Kadhimi. And he enjoyed a high percent. 63% of Iraqis had favorable opinion in Kadhimi. Yet we have to be very careful in reading this number, because if we analyze this number or if we break down this number, we will see that those who have very favorable, this only 18%, while the others, we have almost 50% who have favorable. So in general, the opinion of Iraqi, he enjoy a good support from Iraqi, good opinion from Iraqis. In comparison, with, let us see, with Abdel Mahdi and with al-Abadi in their first month, we will see that Kadhimi now, he has almost the same percent of favorability that al-Abadi enjoyed during his first month on 2014. So al-Abadi had 65% favorability, Kadhimi has 63% favorability, but Abdel Mahdi, he had only 36%. He had much less favorability in his first month in the office. Also, when we ask Iraqi to what extent do you think that Prime Minister has been able to handle his responsibility since the formation of the government, of course, it's still early, but we are measuring the perception of people. It's not, we know that there is nothing yet after 3 weeks to be evaluated by Iraqis, but as pollsters, we are always care about the perception, the atmosphere of Iraqis. And here also we can see a good atmosphere among Iraqis. 60% of Iraqis say that he was able to handle his responsibilities. In comparison with Adil Abdel Mahdi, Adil Abdel Mahdi, only 46% said at the first month of his office that, or Iraqis say that he was able to carry out his responsibilities. Now, as a prime minister evaluation, to what extent, when we ask Iraqis about to what extent they think that prime minister has been able to, how satisfied with the choice of al-Kadhimi. Here also, al-Kadhimi has almost, or Iraqis divided 50-50. 50 say that they were satisfied with choosing Kadhimi as prime minister. In comparison with Adil Abdel Mahdi, the same period, he had 45%. So almost the same. I'm trying to go through numbers very quickly because of the time span.
Sure.
The other thing which also can also affect that dialogue is how Iraqis looks to United States and to Iran. Very interesting numbers. Unfortunately, I cannot show it here, but I will read it to you. When we ask, we always ask Iraqis two specific questions which can measure the attitudes of Iraqis toward different countries. We ask them about all neighbor countries plus US and the favorability of these countries for Iraqis. So on the question about how favorable these countries are, I will just focus on Iran and US as they are the main two players in Iraq right now. And if we look, it's very interesting to see that on 2017, almost 50% of Iraqis had favorable attitudes toward Iran. That was on 2017, while they only 33% of Iraqis, only 1/3 of Iraqis had positive attitudes or favorable attitudes toward the United States. But since 2017, the scene has been changing dramatically. So we end by this week the favorability of Iran among Iraqis only 15%. I
Oh,
repeat, 15, 1, 5. And this is a dramatic drop down in the favorability of Iran among Iraqis, while U.S. still have the same, almost the same favorability. Almost 1/3 of Iraqis have favorable attitudes toward United States. So in general, Iraqis neither favor Iran nor United States. But for the first time since long time, we see that the favorability of United States among Iraqis is double than the favorability of Iran. This is a new phenomena in the Iraqi political theater. Lastly, I will. We ask Iraqis about how do they look to these countries as reliable partner. Do they think that these countries are reliable partner or unreliable partner? So on 2017, those who think that Iran is reliable partner was 74%. 74% of Iraqis on 2017 thought that Iran is a reliable partner. Right now, it's only 14%.
oh,
4.
yeah,
It's
right.
a sharp decline. While for United States, it was 32. Right now, it's almost 18%. So both countries, they don't have a lot of positive attitudes among Iraqis. I know that I might pass my time. Sorry for that. Any question, I will be ready to answer later on. Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Munqith. There are some real surprises here.
Yeah,
I think Kadhimi's popularity, at least for right now, is what I would personally consider a pleasant surprise. I think,
honeymoon. His honeymoon. He is enjoying his honeymoon.
right, a honeymoon. Okay. Maybe it's by comparison with the previous
Yeah,
leaders who were very
yeah,
unpopular.
yeah.
I think that the unfavorability and the unreliability that Iraqis see in Iran, especially compared to where we were just 3 years ago, is quite remarkable. And people might want to comment about what might explain that, what the reasons for that might be, but we'll save that for the discussion session. I do want you to answer very briefly, before I turn to Barbara, one question from the audience, which was simply, how many people did you poll?
Yeah, unfortunately, I was not able to show the slide about the
Right.
methodology. This is very important. It's first of all, these we had 1,000 interviews.
Okay.
It was telephone interviews. Margin of error is 4% with a probability of plus minus. With a probability of 95%, as you know.
Okay.
And and this is the first time we check the favorability and the popularity of the prime minister by Kati due to the
Yes.
COVID-19 restrictions. So
Yes.
yes,
Okay.
yeah.
That's
Thank you.
great. Thank you very much. So it was a sample, a random sample,
Exactly, it's
a
a
phone
random
poll
sample.
of 1,000 Iraqis from all over the country, and I guess,
Yes,
and from all
nationwide.
different communities.
Nationwide.
Terrific. All right. Thank you very much, Munqith. That was fascinating. I apologize to you and to the audience that we couldn't show the slides on the screen right now. And now I want to turn the floor over to my good friend and colleague, Ambassador Barbara Leaf, for about 10 minutes of remarks, and then we'll move to Bilal. Barbara, please.
Thanks, David. And it's interesting, Munqith, that you use the term theater towards the last part of your discussion, your fascinating discussion, because in fact, that's a word that I start with in terms of how I assess what occurred yesterday. So to my perspective, my analysis, the June 11th Zoom dialogue, which is what I'm calling it, can be counted as success as a really necessary piece of political theater, which I will say as a former diplomat is actually much of what diplomacy is all about. So to recall, the Iraqi political context has been overheated since at least January, arguably before, but in particular since January, with the January 3rd targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi, the January 5th core vote, the long and frankly ugly process to seat a new government, and the pandemic, and then the double whammy of the oil price war that came after it. On the US side, there has been growing impatience going back at least a year with militia attacks and the failure of the previous government to muster a response, either verbally or more importantly, operationally. And this was following a year of attacks, including on including the December assault on the U.S. Embassy. There was what I would call unanswered mail. For a year and a half, the U.S. had been quietly asking for a bilateral post-ISIS review of the U.S. and, of course, a coalition military mission. Adel Abdel Mahdi, frankly, always said in private, yes, we should do it. But he was apparently too cowed politically to take that up. There was the pandemic and the continued militia potshots that led to withdrawal of the NATO mission set and a drastic consolidation of the US military force presence, both in country and outside by the US military mission. And then of course we have the presidential elections and the temptation to what I would say, call the troops home. Hanging over the US military mission in Iraq. So with full thanks to the pandemic, the dialogue permitted what I consider a necessary downscoping of the meeting to the essentials. And this is something we talked about some weeks ago in a couple of other fora, but scoping it to the essentials and to the two wolves nearest the sled, which were, for the Iraqi side in particular, the economic, the multi-headed crises hitting Iraq, and for both sides, security. So the Iraqi side dealing with the political pressure coming out of the core vote, and the US laying down a marker on attacks on the US mission. So for Iraq, the Zoom dialogue diffused to a significant degree, I think, the politics around the very notion of a bilateral event, let alone the substance of that event, to a manageable degree. And it flagged for Iraq the priority that both Iraq and the US place on economic support for Iraq going forward. For the US, the communique in particular elegantly wrapped the US military mission in legality by citing the original founding language of the SFA and Status of Forces Agreement, and then more recently the 2014 exchange of diplomatic notes over the request of the government for the US to bring forces back in. And it underscored the government of Iraq's responsibility for the security of that mission. It also, most interestingly to me, offered a very high visibility message to the Iraqi public about US support for elections and government accountability. So in that sense, both sides can call the substance a win. They, and I would also stress that both sides want an early visit to Washington by the Prime Minister, which will itself act as a driver on what we call deliverables that both sides want. So
Barbara, can I just take a brief technical interruption? We got messages that the Arabic translation was interrupted.
Okay.
Is it working now, Mohammed?
And am I going too fast?
Well, I think that Mohammed is just, Mohammed, are you okay? Can you hear him? Bil Arabi? Can the audience هل تسمعون الترجمة بالعربي ولا لا الآن؟ I guess it's okay. All right, thanks. Sorry for the interruption. There was a brief interruption,
Okay.
apparently.
So both sides want an early visit by the Prime Minister to Washington. It was, in a sense, hinted at in the communique, but not explicitly couched as such. But we know that both sides, I see that there is no translation. That's a chat.
All right. Mohammed, can you say something, and let's see if we can hear you. Okay, بالعربي احكي بالعربي من فضلك. موجود بس okay, ماشي. Okay, thank you. Okay. Yalla. Barbara, sorry again. Please.
So the visit, the visit itself, whether it is the higher level committee, but principally if al-Kadhimi does end up coming to Washington later in the summer, it will help drive deliverables that both sides want. So on the Iraqi side, again, economic support, whether sovereign loan guarantees, specific commercial deals, technical MOUs, or other tangible measures. And it would logically also help kick off what has to come, which is a post-ISIS military-to-military staff talks. Now, I'll just throw out a few final cautionary notes in the midst of all this exuberance. The modest terms of this first meeting helpfully defanged the issue for the time being of that January 5th Council Representatives vote, and to a lesser degree, the whole notion of a continued US military presence. But the language of the communique about the mission will itself put pressure on both the US and Iraq. So continued rocket and mortar attacks in the face of a public statement underlining the legality of the US presence will be seen as a clear challenge internally to the Prime Minister and require a clear response from him. He will also need to do what Adel Abdel Mahdi was unwilling to do for political reason, which is greenlight that next step, staff talks, which will also indicate whether and under what circumstances other NATO and coalition members will be willing to return and participate in the security mission. And that may be a chicken and egg issue. Wrapping the US security assistance program within a larger NATO effort will be, of course, politically more palatable, but NATO members are going to want to see whether the US training mission stays or leaves and under what conditions. Also, international lenders will react negatively if militia attacks continue and electoral politics in the US side or other factors lead to the US consolidating out of Iraq. There will be a corollary chill in that instance that will settle on Gulf country enthusiasm to engage, whether financially, with investments, or politically. And finally, ISIS resurgence is a real threat out there on the not so distant horizon. Even pro-Iranian politicians and militia figures are beginning to reverse themselves without acknowledging such, and acknowledging the need for further foreign assistance to the Iraqi security forces. So you've seen Qais al-Khazali essentially saying, well, if you're staying, then you must abide by Iraqi law. Well, that's an easy one. That box is checked. And others in private have said to US officials, well, keep the ISR, keep the intel, keep the training, but everything else should go. When, of course, that is by and large what the US military offers now and would offer in the future, as these interlocutors well know. So the best thing, in my view, is for both countries to push for an early Kadhimi visit. And there you are.
Okay. Barbara, thank you so much for that really excellent analysis, both of the background and of the future prospects for US-Iraqi cooperation. I want to turn the floor over now to my good friend and colleague, Bilal Wahab, and I want to just clarify that he is the Wagner Fellow at the Washington Institute, the same family that supports Fikra Forum, the blog that I run for the Washington Institute. And I would urge all of you, if you're interested in more material, to take a look at that. We do have already on the chat room a question that I would like to relay to you, Bilal, which is, what is the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government's role and stakes in this dialogue? What do they want to get out of it? What are the prospects that you see that they will get something out of it? And as someone who is not only an expert and a scholar, but from Kurdistan yourself, I think you're in an extra good position to respond to that question in your remarks. So Bilal, please, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So again, thank you, Dave, and hello to everyone who's joining us. Excellent question. Maybe I'll actually use that as segue into what I was planning to say. I think first and foremost, I woke up to go through the Iraqi media, and this dialogue did not make as many headlines as I was expecting. And that's perhaps for a good reason, that Iraq is starting to look inwardly, that for the first time, and inwardly by that I mean, on the one hand, the financial crisis that's hitting all of the petro-states, but Iraq is hit particularly hard. But the headlines there is some of the austerity measures that the Iraqi government recently had to take, and now is going back on them and rescinding those decisions. That on one hand, and of course, all of the developments and day-to-day developments around surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. So I say that this is a good thing, because one of the problems that Iraq has had, in its recent history, is that all of the problems were important problems, and therefore all of the solutions had to also be imported. But now, for the first time, there is accountability within the Iraqi system, and so such an important event did make headlines, just not as many, or it was at least in competition with COVID-19 pandemic and austerity measure dynamics, which are purely internal decisions and internally policy making. So that the Iraqi public or the Iraqi media looks inwardly and holds its own government accountable, to my mind, is perhaps a positive evolution. On that theme, there are a few issues that Iraq has always looked outwards for assistance, but now I think increasingly the solutions must come within. And among those is the relationship between the Kurdistan regional government and the federal government of Iraq, Erbil and Baghdad. Key among those is the question of oil management and revenue sharing. The KRG did establish an autonomous oil and gas sector. When it was serving a geopolitical reason, namely the Kurdish aspiration for independence, that had some public buy-in. But when the referendum in 2017 was undermined by regional powers as well as military action by the Iraqi government, and the lack of support to Kurdistan's efforts by the international community, including the United States, the geopolitical risks that the KRG is taking, the financial losses that the KRG is incurring, has started to make little sense and have less support from the Kurdish public. For example, the Iraq Oil Report reported that KRG revenues from last year if they were sold by the Iraqi government rather than independently by the Kurdistan government, the KRG could have made $1.6 billion extra money. And so that kind of numbers may not impact the economy so much when you have a grandiose proposal or project like independence, or when oil prices are soaring at $80 and $90 per barrel. But they do definitely sting when the government of Iraq and the government of Kurdistan are unable to pay salaries on time, and they keep accumulating arrears. So perhaps with oil federalism not offering the kind of dividends in terms of transparency, good governance, and accountability that particularly the Kurdish government asked for on one hand, and then the Iraqi government not being able to undermine the emergence of a Kurdish independent energy sector through legal action, political action, and at times military action, perhaps the time is ripe for both sides to sit down this time around to not only have a gentleman's handshake as they have done in the past, but to really put the Iraqi energy sector on a more legally sound framework, which then segues into many of the key reforms that, not only the United States government, but the World Bank, the IMF, and most recently the International Energy Agency have recommended to Iraq, none of which are, by the way, new, but it requires the Iraqi government to reform the entirety of the energy sector, the electricity sector, which is burdened with inefficiencies, including burning gas and burning Iraqi gas only to buy Iranian gas, again, at the cost to the Iraqi coffers, let alone the environmental impact that one has, but also encouraging public waste of electricity and water and other services because the government fails to accrue and collect fees from those services. Not only is it encouraging waste, but it's also a financial loss to the Iraqi government. So the Kurdish government, which has comparatively done a much better job in terms of economic development, infrastructure building, has an opportunity to perhaps share some of those reforms with the Iraqi government. One of the points that attracted my attention in the communique from yesterday's dialogue was Iraq's commitment that it needs serious reforms. Now, this in itself, I think, is quite important, is significant, to acknowledge that we need reform, that the Iraqi government needs reform, and the United States offering to provide technical assistance with that reform. Now, of course, as I said earlier, the need for reform has been clear, but the political will and ability to deliver those reforms has been the question. And perhaps one reason why the Iraqi government has failed to deliver those reforms. And let me just put in context what I mean by failing to deliver those reforms. For example, part of the public protest that took place in the fall of 2019 was particularly against lack of services. And one reason why the services are so in such bad shape in Iraq is because the kind of economic and bureaucratic reforms that Iraq has needed in order to promote investment in infrastructure has failed. So it has become a public mandate. Another example of Iraq's failure at economic and financial reform is that the Iraqi government has basically defaulted and came across at fault or withdrew from 3, not 1, not 2, but 3 standby agreements with the IMF, the latest of which was at the hands of former Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi. So even in terms of credibility, Iraq isn't doing so well. It signs off to commitments to reform when the oil prices are low, but then for political reasons or perhaps when oil prices recover, all of those reforms would be the first to escape out of the window. Why has reform been so difficult? And perhaps also a question that a recent Iraqi analyst once asked, does Iraq need reform, financial reform, or does it need financial revolution? And perhaps if reforms are not achieved and it becomes such a structural issue, then, akin to the political system that the public revolted against, perhaps the economy will be too lost for reforms and perhaps needs a complete overhaul. The answer to my question, to my rhetorical question of why Iraq has been unable to perform and provide the political will to support such reforms is Iraq's very system of mainly patronage politics. Patronage politics, in short, is this big tent politics of Iraq, in which every political party that gets enough seats to be in parliament and therefore translate those into government positions, according to the horse trading that takes place every time there is an election in Iraq. And that allows for, instead of identity politics to then become a financial enterprise in which parties use their identity politics to get into parliament, then to get into government. And while no power in Iraq, no political party or sect has the ability to capture the entirety of the Iraqi state, the parties have the ability to then capture a ministry or two, or perhaps a sector. And then they use that sector, be it health, be it a service sector or a security sector, to then dole out contracts to their cronies and reward their supporters, and then make enough money to also, finance media agencies and TV stations, then help, with their next election. And you can see that, militias are in that game, parties are in that game, and sometimes even rich business people engage in that game. And then when the legal system doesn't protect businesses or contracts, then oftentimes the militias act as enforcers, as if this was a mafia state. So no one finds the ability and the power to shake the system, because it requires collective action. And on the other, it's a system that supports myopia and somehow works for everyone, because, as I said, it's Big Tent government. So even when there is accusations or grievances about corruption, it's not so much to end it, but about the fair distribution of corruption in Iraq. Now, this is coming to a halt, because the game of patronage politics, I think, is coming to somewhat to an end. Because there is only so many people that these political parties can hire into government offices, which is already bloated. And this system works when oil prices are high and cash is flowing into the Iraqi system. And at times of low oil prices, basically the government runs its course, and then it would be the younger generation who basically left out to dry, who are angry, and it's that younger generation who's not benefiting from the patronage system, because again, as I said, is expiring and running out of steam, that is now able to mobilize and change governments. What to do, perhaps briefly, and given Munqith's numbers and the protest movement, Prime Minister Kadhimi has a public mandate on one hand, and also he's going through a honeymoon. But of course, the honeymoon is not at the best of times, because he has to put out multiple fires at the same time. But again, the mandate works in his favor. I think the dialogue and the commitment works in his favor. Having a strong team around him, including in the cabinet, but also in the Prime Minister's office, who do mean well, who appreciate Iraq's need for reforms, is also a positive factor. But in terms of what needs to be done, perhaps there are some priorities, and of course holding in mind that he is leading a transitional government and there is not so much that he can do, but perhaps to achieve the goal of having credible elections next year, or perhaps in 2 years, but also put out some of the fires, but then more importantly, lay the foundation for the reforms that Iraq has committed to. There are perhaps a few priorities. One, corruption has become an explicit and an implicit central issue in Iraq, and therefore targeting corruption should be not only a slogan like other prime ministers, but perhaps a seriously considered and planned for program. But also the relationship with the KRG is also an opportunity to perhaps cut some of the waste that comes from not trusting each other. There is opportunity to cooperate over gas. There is opportunity to cooperate over electricity. There is no need for Iraq to have different tariff systems. So that's also perhaps an opportunity, especially for areas around the disputed territories that came under ISIS, and requires a lot of cooperation for both sides, not only for security, but also for reconstruction. Perhaps on a sectoral level, the banking sector and banking sector reform is the most important. The slogan of any anti-corruption campaign is follow the money. And that is literally impossible in Iraq, because Iraq remains a cash economy. So I would put that as high up in the priority. Another hotbed of corruption in Iraq is the dollar auction, which is an opportunity only for people with oligarchical styles to be able to access that market. And that not only is it an avenue for corruption, money laundering, perhaps helping Iran, but it's also a waste of money that the Iraqi government cannot afford right now. Some service sector reforms would be absolutely necessary, but since my focus here is about politics, I think one area where the new Iraqi government should focus on is party finances. The richest and wealthiest in Iraq are not the businessmen, but they are the politicians. And for every businessman that has a TV station, you have 20 political parties or party activists that have TV stations. I think that's worth looking into. Where did these political parties get their money from? I think Iraqis know the answer, and perhaps this team, with the help of exposure and accountability, and perhaps global Magnitsky Act threats, the United States can help put greater transparency into party financing. And that will perhaps, and my last point here, help the Iraqi government to limit not only Iran's exploitation of corruption in Iraq, but perhaps also limit Iran's use of what the Foreign Affairs recently called strategic corruption in Iraq, how Iran has been using and abusing and also promoting corruption in Iraq because it helps Iran's influence-wielding operations in that country. I think there is opportunity for the Iraqi government, there is opportunity for the U.S. government to help with this new team, but this is going to be a tall order because the problems are historic and well-entrenched. With that, I close. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Bilal. There's one question that I can answer very quickly on your behalf, which is one of our listeners asked if you, Bilal, are representing the Kurdistan government, and the answer is no. You are an independent scholar, and you're speaking, of course, in your personal and expert capacity, not in any official sense, and you are not actually connected at all with the government of the Kurdistan region or of Iraq, but with the Washington Institute, which is an independent, nonpartisan think tank, a research institute. So I would like now to refer to all three of our panelists a question that several of our audience members posed, which is about corruption. And the question is, how can the United States help Iraq to combat corruption? And some people ask more specifically, especially when many militias rely on corruption to finance their activities and undermine the authority of the Iraqi state. So let's go in order, and I'm going to ask you, Munqith, if you would like to give your answer to that question. It's a really tough and sensitive, but also really important question. How exactly can the United States help Iraq to combat corruption?
Yeah. Well, as everyone knows that this is one of the most difficult question to be answered, but my direct reaction to that question is, which is from my friend Sadiq, is first of all, we have to ask ourselves how Iraq can defeat corruption. It's a task which should be implemented, done by Iraqis themselves. No matter how much United States will put pressures or help Iraqis, if they don't want to help themselves to solve this problem, then there is no benefit. But it's good to know that there are many ways which U.S. can help Iraqis through it. One of it is, I think there was, and as I recall from the CPA at that time, there was an inspector and there was an ambassador who has been appointed by the U.S. State Department to investigate. And I think he went through many details, thousands of documents, etc., etc. I think this is one of the things which can be delivered to Iraqis to take care of, or to review all these documents and go back to it. I mean, this is one of the things. The other thing is eliminating the I think the pressures on Iran and others will eventually eliminate many of, or will dry many of the resources which can be used for corruption. As Bilal just mentioned, we have in Iraq, it's the politics are, of course, politics everywhere in the world is suffering from corruption, but not in the same way we have it in Iraq. So eliminating the power of militias, eliminating the power of some parties, putting pressures, threatening with sanctions. I think these are effective ways which can be used by United States. But all these can or means nothing if Iraqis does not decide to help themselves to defeat corruption. I think this is the main challenge for Kadhimi, and I have addressed it to him directly. I think the guy is realizing that this is his main challenge. He will work on it, but let us see how it will go through.
Okay. Thank you very much, Munqith. You made a very important point that there's only so much the United States can do. But if we get cooperation and partnership with the new Kadhimi government, this might be an opportunity to address that really difficult issue of corruption. Barbara, would you please chime in on this?
Look, I mean, I think I've been asked about this recently myself, and I come back to a point that both of my co-speakers have made very eloquently, which is this is an Iraqi problem. The scope and the nature of the problem is well understood. This is nothing new. This is nothing, whether you call it, the results of how the U.S. Began its, with the CPA. In any case, what you have now is very clearly institutionalized. It's not, I mean, the militias are essentially have gravitated towards that well-established system. They didn't create it. I mean, the party essentially have created, and over a series of administrations. Now, essentially, the U.S. and other foreign donors can provide technical expertise, but it's not for lack of knowledge. It is political will, and as Bilal said, and Munqith aptly demonstrated, the Prime Minister has the wind of public opinion at his back. He has got to constantly frame the tough things he's going to be doing in that front and center, with an anti-corruption effort with a capital C, and growing the economy by ridding it of corruption. And the banking sector reform is key to that. You professionalize it, modernize it, digitalize it, and that transparency and the record keeping itself is going to make it much harder, at least, for these parties to function the way they will. But the ability of a party or a movement like the Sadrists just simply wholly own the Ministry of Health for years, or the Badr gang to run the Ministry of Interior with all the attendant contracts, they don't need us to diagnose that.
Okay, so everybody knows the problem. The question really is how to muster the political will, both inside Iraq and, to the extent that we can, in the United States and other international partners of Iraq, to make this really the top priority, or one of the top priorities. I think that's an excellent answer. And what I'm going to do, since we only have a few minutes left, is try and combine several questions, interesting ones, that I've received from our audience, and address them to the panel. And there are basically three kinds of questions here. One has to do with the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government. And two of our audience participants asked, first of all, and this would be to Bilal primarily, I think, do you think that it's a good idea for the KRG to agree to send all of its oil revenues back to Baghdad and receive a share of them in return, or not? Which seems to be what the Baghdad government is requesting right now. And related to that, from another participant, do you think that there will be more difficult issues between Erbil and Baghdad in the near future, which I have to say is not really, as far as I can see from the communique, part of the U.S. Iraq strategic dialogue, at least not so far. There is a brief reference to the disputed territories, but more in the context of security against ISIS than of reaching any agreement between Baghdad and Erbil. So, question about the KRG and its relationship to Baghdad in the near future on oil and on other issues, and is there an American role in any of this? Bilal, very briefly, if you could, please.
Sure. I'll start with the second part of the question. The KRG had a representative at the dialogue, Mr. Fawzi Hariri, who was sitting on the Iraqi side, not separate. So part of the Iraqi delegation was a KRG representative, and that is good for KRG-Baghdad relations. The United States could do well, obviously, by remaining engaged in bringing KRG and Baghdad closer together, because when the relation between Erbil and Baghdad is bad, then that impacts negatively on the U.S. mission in Iraq, which is to fight ISIS, especially in the disputed territories.
Right.
Definitely blunts reform and encourages lack of transparency. And it's also creates more animosity in a country where identity politics is usually used and abused for political gain. So a better KRG-Baghdad relation is definitely better for both Baghdad and Erbil. And there are things that the Iraqi government can offer the KRG, such as, sovereign loans, the international aid and assistance that the Iraqi government as a sovereign can get, and things that the KRG can offer, such as, being kind of a safer haven and perhaps a headquarter for many of the companies and firms that perhaps find it too early to be in a place like Basra, but they can definitely start in a place like Erbil or Sulaymaniyah. For the first question, yes, I think a decade after oil federalism has been tried in Iraq, we have our answer. Oil for what? For the Kurds, as I mentioned, it was oil for independence, for statehood. Well, unfortunately, that's not going anywhere. Right? That was made very clear with the referendum. Okay, well then, if it's not for independence, then what is it for? Then it becomes oil for money. Well, if it's oil for money, then this opaque, somewhat independent energy policy doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. Why is the KRG losing $10 per barrel, including the companies that work in the KRG, for political risk? That political risk, that $10 per barrel is probably worth it if you're looking into, again, something like independence. But in the absence of that starts to just be, money at the table, which is inefficiency. That's one economic cost. But also there is political cost to the KRG. Mind you, the last time the KRG parliament passed a budget was in 2013. So this secrecy of, this is our oil and we have to protect it and Baghdad must not see what's going on, has really contributed to lack of transparency and corruption in KRG finances. And again, that is not something that the public is tolerating anymore, because again, the government is running out of excuses as to why the Iraqi government is able to pay salaries at least from 2014 until this year, and why the KRG hasn't, and why despite selling 500,000 barrels of oil a day, the KRG is some $20 to $27 billion in debt. The Kurdish public has started to ask these questions, and the Kurdish government is running out of logical and credible answers. So perhaps I go back to my point that oil should not be a political tool, but an economic tool. And if oil is for for money and not for some political ambition, then I think that both sides can sit down and agree.
Excellent. Thank you. We have just a couple of minutes left on our clock, and I'm going to ask Munqith in response to a question from Alan Makovsky in our US audience here. If you could please send us all a demographic break of your new polling numbers by Sunni, Kurdish, and Shia respondents. Can you do that for us, Munqith? I think would be of great interest. Can you unmute?
Yes. I will send this.
Okay, that's perfect.
But it is nationally representative, so everything is. I mean, the all provinces are proportionally representatives.
Yes.
Males, females are proportionally representatives. So I will send it through. But I had just one comment here on the question with Bilal about the KRG. I think now al-Kadhimi is in excellent position to start KRG Baghdad strategic dialogue. It is the time. It is the time right now.
Yes.
And if you ask me my personal question for history, I will say that I will encourage Kurdistan to have independence from Iraq. It's because obviously the two systems in one country does not work. It's like we are like Hong Kong and China. It's almost the same. It doesn't work. So it's worth to go into strategic dialogue, and if both Kurds and Baghdad decided to stay, then there must be a pillar, and there must be a framework, there must be principles to agree on it, whether on oil and gas or other, or they might reach a conclusion that eventually Kurdistan should be independent after 10 years, after 5 years, I don't know, but it was to start seriously negotiating, debating about the future of the relationship. The relationship now is like, it's like putting a child in incubator. The incubator, for how much time we should keep our relation in that incubator, that should be solved eventually.
That's really interesting. I think from your answers to that, we can all see, first of all, that Bilal is not a representative of the Kurdistan regional government.
I think it's the book behind it. It's the album.
And from Munqith's answer, that there are some people in Iraq who are not Kurds, but who still think that Kurdistan might deserve and be better off, and that Iraq as a whole might be better off going its separate way from Kurdistan. And I would just say that although Iraqis might, I kind of doubt it, but might be able someday to agree on that, we also have to think about Iraq's neighbors, right? Iran and Turkey, and whether they would ever agree to independence for Iraqi Kurdistan. I think that's a really serious problem. I'm going to give Barbara the last word here, Ambassador Leaf, because several of our audience members asked whether in one form or another, I will summarize there, whether the United States is tired of Iraq, and whether, even though we're having this strategic dialogue, we can expect or not expect continued serious American interest in Iraq beyond just keeping a few troops there to fight ISIS.
Yeah, thank you, David. And I saw the one of our audience members put it in terms of, would we just be leaving behind a few bases in this war-driven kind of country? Well, first of all, I think I draw your attention to the deliberate framing of this in the communique that, the U.S. has no intention of or desire to have permanent bases there. And in fact, the U.S. government and I think this is supported in a bipartisan way in the Congress, is looking also to morph the relationship away from a strictly security-driven one into a broader and more sustainable one. I do think you have to distinguish in the question between what is the public, the American public one, versus what is the professional cadre and a new administration or even administration want. The public wants out of endless wars, the endless, so-called endless wars. And to the degree that it can look at not just Iraq, but the Middle East in the framework of non-security driven relationships, there's ample support for that. So no, I think we have a footing and we have, moreover, an abiding national security interests in seeing this shape the relationship onto a very sustainable footing that is congruent with both countries' interests.
Right. Well, thank you for that answer. For any of you who, and I agree with it for what that's worth, if any of you is interested in my own take on this question, please look at the Washington Institute website and look up a paper that I wrote back in January, right after the United States targeted Qasem Soleimani and Abdul Mahdi al-Muhandis on Iraqi soil. I wrote a paper called 8 Reasons Why the United States and Iraq Still Need Each Other. And that will give you at least my perspective on this really important question. Yes, the United States, as Barbara just said, is at the popular level tired of endless wars, but I think there are still some good, solid reasons why the US government is still interested in maintaining a working relationship with, especially with this new Iraqi government. And on that note, I apologize to a few people whose questions I didn't get to. I will relay them to our participants privately. Munqith, you have a couple of questions about your polling data from a few people, and thank you very much for your contribution. Thanks very much to Barbara and to Bilal. I'm happy to say that even though we're 10 minutes over time, we've kept almost everyone from our original audience online with us during this presentation. So on behalf of the Washington Institute, all of our panelists, and myself, I want to thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime as the U.S. Iraqi strategic dialogue continues. Once again, thank you, and until next time, ila liqa. Bye-bye.